And I'm aware that all of you bring your own experiences and your own expertise with different relational approaches around the world. So I'm hoping that what I can talk about in the next few minutes will just help to open up those conversations for all of you to share your expertise over the next couple of hours in this symposium. So there's wide recognition around the world that the huge global sustainability challenges that we face, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, to name but a few, have been created by these intersecting processes of modernism, industrial capitalism, and colonialism. And modernism is a very broad term. It's used in different ways, and I use it here also in a very broad way to refer to these ideas and practices originating in Western Europe around scientific, industrial, and societal development over the past 500 years or so. And the paradigm underpinning the modernist project, the knowledge paradigm underpinning the modernist project, is this idea of fundamentally separate social and ecological entities or substances or essences that then interact with each other. And this fundamental separation between entities has produced a range of dichotomies or dualisms that you're probably very familiar with already. So mind and matter, knowledge and action, structure and agency, individuals and society, humans and nature. The list is almost endless and maps onto this fundamental distinction between social and ecological entities. And these dichotomies are present in approaches to development that exploit nature through extractive resource use, but also through approaches that attempt to preserve nature, such as protected areas. And the entities-based paradigm, a paradigm of separate entities that interact, has been useful for some things. For example, breaking the human body down into separable entities has been useful for producing medicines and so on. However, that entities-based paradigm has also generated socio-environmental destruction, injustice, and continuing colonial violences when reflected in relationships between society and nature. And as I think you all spoke about, as Tobias mentioned, at the Transcultural Leadership Summit back in 2023, if we wish to address these global challenges that have been caused by modernism, we need to nurture fundamental transformations to sustainability. And the need for transformations is now recognized at the highest levels of global science policy engagement and collaboration. So the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, that some of you might be familiar with already. It's known as the IPCC for biodiversity and linked to the United Nations, states that transformations to sustainability will require fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors, including development paradigms, goals, and values needed for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being, and sustainable development. But if we're reorganizing and transforming away from the modernist paradigms of thought and action, what are we transforming to? And so there's been increasing engagement in conversations around sustainability transformations with relational ways of knowing, doing, and being as a way of initiating this paradigm shift. And there are many, many different relational life ways, practices, and philosophies around the world. So, for example, some of the references on this slide, Parsons and Fisher, 2020, explore indigenous relational approaches to transformation. And Karen O'Brien and colleagues develop fractal relational approaches to transformation. So this illustration on this slide comes from the work of O'Brien and colleagues. And I think you'll be hearing from many exciting speakers over the course of this symposium about relationality from different perspectives. You'll have Yolanda Steenkamp talking about Ubuntu, as well as Bayo Komalafe and Ken Gergen, among many others, who'll be discussing different relational perspectives as well. And I'd just like to open up at this point and invite you all to pop in the chat or in the Miro board the different relational approaches that you have engaged with and that you're coming from. It'll be really great to see where you're all coming from in terms of your own experiences. So personally, I first came to relationality primarily through Western philosophical traditions of post-structuralism, of pragmatism, and process relational philosophy, which Joseph has already mentioned some of these, through thinkers like Bruno Latour, John Dewey, as a pragmatist, and Alfred North Whitehead. And the diagram on this slide comes from a paper that colleagues and I published back in 2020 when we tried to trace how these relational traditions were contributing to a paradigm shift in sustainability science, which is a field heavily influenced by systems thinking. And relational thinking in these traditions emphasize a number of shifts in thinking and practice. So firstly, a shift in thinking from static entities towards continually unfolding relations. So from these perspectives, relationships actually create entities and bring them into being. So entities are understood as just a temporary coming together, temporary assemblage of relations. Secondly, a shift from distanced knowledge to embodied experience. So recognizing we cannot know the world as a distanced observer, but only through our engagements, our interactions, our experiences with the world. Thirdly, a shift from understanding language as describing the world to language as representing certain ontologies or worldviews and actively intervening in and shaping the world. And so the English language is largely based on around an entities-based worldview. And there's recognition that as English speakers will need to develop new language and concepts to reflect and embody more relational understandings. Many other languages are structured around more relational philosophies, but not so much English. And finally, a shift from notions of control and extraction in our relations with human and non-human beings towards ethics and practices of care. And since this paper was published in 2020 through engagement and conversations with many colleagues around the world, also working on sustainability transformations, we learned of the many other traditions of relationality that in many cases are much older than the traditions that we were familiar with when we first started writing. And in these different traditions, the notion of relationality is used in different ways for different purposes, but also with lots of resonances and shared connections between them. And this recognition of these differences, but also these connections between the ways in which scholars, practitioners, social movements, governments are using the term relationality, led us to develop a paper that was recently published in the journal Ecosystems and People. So this paper is titled Relational Approaches to Sustainability Transformations, Walking Together in a World of Many Worlds. And this was a collaborative work with Jamila Haider, Tilman Hertz, Maria Mancia Garcia, Michelle Lee Moore. And this paper is a contribution to a special issue, actually, in Ecosystems and People, titled A Relational Turn in Sustainability for Social Ecological Transformations. So many of the papers are published already, and there's more coming out over the next few months. And we aim to finalize this special issue next year. So if you're interested in relationality and sustainability transformations, then please take a look at this journal and this special issue. And in this paper, we attempt to map out some of the different approaches to and conversations around relationality in the field of sustainability transformations. Our aim is not to cover everything, but highlight some of the distinctiveness, but also the interconnections and overlaps between different approaches, without closing down around one single definition of relationality. And so if we look at this image, we have moving clockwise from the top left, structural metabolic relationalities, indigenous kinship relationalities, systemic analytical relationalities, Latin American post-development relationalities, and post-humanist performative relationalities. And each of these conversations or groupings is mobilizing the term relationality in a slightly different way. I'll run through them briefly in the next few slides, and I apologize in advance. I'm going to be moving very quickly through them because of time. So apologies for this simple picture I'll present of them, but hopefully it gives an impression of the complexity that each one holds within it. So in what we call systemic analytical relationalities, researchers working with social ecological systems approaches in sustainability science are increasingly drawing on process relational philosophy of Whitehead and others to try to move away from this dichotomy between social and ecological entities and develop new understandings of causality, agency, and change in transformations. In these conversations, relationality is approached as an analytical process of identifying interdependencies between entities and the relations that actually generate entities. In a different conversation, a different grouping that we refer to as structural metabolic relationalities, We see researchers working with, for instance, Marxist political economy analysis that are drawing on these notions of metabolism to highlight and challenge extractive modes of resource production. In these conversations, relationality is approached as a metabolic, a material, and embodied process of converting resources into energy. In the third stream, which we refer to as post-humanist performative relationalities, researchers are working with post-humanist and performative social science to highlight the centrality of non-human beings to social life, and in so doing, decentering the human in pursuit of sustainability. So in these conversations, relationality is approached as a performative process of enacting associations with others. And you'll notice that in the visualizations associated with these approaches, entities are actually generated within this unfolding flux of relations. Meanwhile, Indigenous scholars and philosophers are articulating the links between Indigenous governance resurgence, sovereignty, and decolonization movements to notions of sustainability transformations. In these conversations, relationality is approached in terms of maintaining kinship obligations and responsibilities with human and non-human beings. And this image shows a woven kinship cycle for Yolngu peoples in Northern Australia from this wonderful paper by Bawaka Country and colleagues, 2016. And finally, in another stream of scholarship that we describe as Latin American post-development relationalities, researchers, activists, and communities are drawing on the relations between Indigenous, peasant, environmental, student, and women's movements to develop transformations beyond conventional modes of development. And in these approaches, relationality is addressed in terms of the pursuit of more regenerative and communal ways of living. So if we think back over these multiple relationalities, themselves containing very many different approaches, this suggests to us that pursuing relational approaches to sustainability transformations isn't simply about replacing one modernist paradigm with one single relational paradigm, but it's more about opening up for multiplicity, for diversity, and solidarity between different approaches. So drawing inspiration from the Zapatista movement, scholars like Juanita Sumber and Marisol de la Cadena, we suggest that relational approaches lead to a vision of transformation as walking together in a world of many worlds. And walking together is about practical action, it's about engagement and care in support of multiplicity, but also connection. And I'll finish with two very quick and different examples of what walking together might look like in practice. So this first example, walking together in Northern Australia, comes from some of the very place-based work that I've been lucky enough to play a very small part in over the past few years, led by Rembang Indigenous scholar Otto Campion. So in Northern Australia, Indigenous landowners and rangers are working with conservation organisations and governments to care for country. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, the usage of the term country, it's used in Australia for a term to describe the relations between people, land, stories, values, ancestors, all together. So Otto and colleagues have developed the Rembanga concept of Balpura, guide good faith, respectful collaborations between these actors in the Arafura Swamp region. And the word Balpura roughly translates into English as partner or partnership. In Balpura camps represented in this diagram, Indigenous landowners, rangers, and Western conservationists work together around shared purposes towards healthy country, drawing on both Western and Indigenous knowledge systems at the same time, establishing respectful connections between them, but without necessarily integrating or reducing one to the other. And if you'd like to read more about Balpura, then you can check out this article by Otto Campion and colleagues, cited here, which is also where this diagram comes from. My second example is at a much broader international level, and it comes from the work of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, which is a global body tasked with producing scientific assessments of the status of biodiversity around the world and the impacts of human activities upon biodiversity. So traditionally, these global assessment bodies like IPBES have organized themselves around one single conceptual framework, specifying the connections between biodiversity and human actions with very specific singular definitions for key concepts. However, the IPBES add a recognition of the diverse ways in which people around the world conceive of the relations between humans and nature, has decided to organize itself around multiple conceptual frameworks. So if you look at this diagram, you can see the color coding. In the black categories are intended to be inclusive categories relevant for many or even all actors. The green categories are reflective of Western ecological science. And the blue are illustrative categories intended to reflect concepts more familiar within indigenous and local knowledge systems, as well as social sciences and humanities perspectives. So while the framework is not perfect by any means and has come in for critique from some areas, it's another example of developing commonalities while embracing difference and diversity. And so IPBES is actually releasing a global assessment report on sustainability transformations next month on the 18th of December, exploring strategies and actions to enable fundamental system-wide reorganization. So if you're interested in these topics, look out for that. It'll be very interesting to see how IPBES engaged with relationality and how that's engaged within the report. So to wrap up, both the Balpura and IPBES are just two examples of what walking together might look like in practice. And I'm sure you'll have many examples from your own work, your own experiences, your own context. So please feel welcome to share those also in the chat. And in the paper, we find that this notion of walking together is a useful way of embracing what we call the uncommons in collaborative work towards sustainability. And so the uncommons is the idea of interests in common that are not necessarily the same interests and that are committed to negotiating their difficult being together in heterogeneity. So I think over the next couple of hours, you'll probably also be walking together in a world of many worlds yourselves in this symposium. And I wish you all the best in this journey. Unfortunately, it'll be too late for me to join you for the rest of the symposium, but hopefully I'll be able to join you next time. So thanks so much for listening. And if there's any time, I'm happy to hear any thoughts, reflections, questions. Otherwise, please feel welcome to contact me at this email address too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Simon, and thank you so much for still being awake with us. And thank you also for pointing out the connection between your work and also the work that we have done here at the Transcultural Caravan, and also how it might be connected to the role of commonalities. If there are some questions here in the room, you just raise your hand and we forward to Simon. We have a bit of time for some questions. Then, of course, we move to the workshops. We might run a bit into the break. We have a bit of a puffer time here. And yeah, I see there's some applause, and I see also some question, if I'm right, in the chat. Question for Simon. You mentioned in the beginning the fractal framework, if I remember correctly. How does the fractal theory integrate in the rationality concept in more detail? Oh, that sounds like a detailed question, especially the mathematical equation, and how can we integrate the relational approach? Simon, do you have a quick, understandable answer for us to such a question? Otherwise, I see more questions coming in. If you have a question here, feel free. Otherwise,
that's a fantastic question. I'm not a mathematician, so I won't be able to provide you a quick summary, but I recommend going to the O'Brien article for more details. What I would say is that I think the key contribution that the authors, in my understanding of their work, use in terms of the fractal approach is that it helps thinking about scaling in transformations. So a relational approach, at least in potentially post-structural traditions, thinks in terms of flat relationships, non-hierarchical relationships. And traditionally in transformations research, there's been a lot of thinking about cross-scale relations from local to global. And the fractal theory is used by the authors to develop a more relational, non-hierarchical approach to scaling. That's my short answer. I hope that helps a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. And due to there is some question I see in the Q&A session. I think you can also open it. Some questions. Otherwise, I mean, we don't have time to answer all the questions. We will share the link of your article. It's on the Miro board and also other work, of course, with all our participants. It's great to see we have now over 160 people joining, so it worked with the Zoom. I'm happy here on this side. But maybe just to close, Simon, we have to, of course, try to get some time back. a short answer, a short question. We have a lot of young students sitting here at Zeppelin University, but also joining. And if they are interested in this relational paradigm shift, what you would encourage them, where to start, or what to look at?
Yeah, great question. I think to begin with, your book, right? You have the the book published by your group, which is fantastic. I think the special issue that I mentioned during the talk in Ecosystems and People, the journal, is a fantastic resource from scholars across the world in many different cultural contexts, exploring different notions of relationality. So that's in the journal Ecosystems and People, and I recommend starting there. That would be a great place to get an overview of the field.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. And I think a round of applause for being with us from our side, but also online. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you, everyone, and best of luck in the symposium.
We let you to get some well-deserved shut-eye. We stay in contact also for further research. Maybe if there are some students here to maybe participate next year in the transcultural student research groups and you're interested in the research of Simon, let us know. We can connect you, and I know Simon is happy to share his work and involve students from around the world. Yeah, thank you so much.